All right, so I want to move on thinking about, we were just talking about how diversity increases productivity, and now I want to talk about how diversity increases stability. All right, so what we're generally talking about here is community stability. So the how a stable a community is, and what we're talking about is the numbers, the abundance of all the species. So think about, like how many individuals of plants, herbivores, everything, predators in the system, and how stable that is. Now, oftentimes we'll just group that community into a certain functional group, so like just plants or something, or we'll only look at the most common individual or the common species. But when we're thinking about community stability, we're talking about how variant those abundances are over time. Okay, how much do the numbers of individuals change throughout several years, throughout a season? Doesn't really matter what time frame we're talking about. But community stability is really different than individual stability. Okay, so a community itself can be really stable with having the numbers really fluctuate on an individual level really wildly. So, this is a classic example of the Hudson Bay Fur Trading Company looking at hares in the red here and lynx populations in Canada, basically over about 100 years. And what we see is, there's super big fluctuations in the hare, but we don't necessarily know what's going on in other types of, or what I should say is other parts of the community, right? So what we know here is that the hare is not stable. The populations of hare and the population of lynx themselves are not stable. But we don't know what's happening to the moose in this system, the deer in this system, the squirrels in the system. And those all might fluctuate, yes, but they might, take up some of this, be in high numbers. The squirrels might be in high numbers when the hares are in low numbers. So a community can be stable even if the individuals are not stable. So one of the main reasons why we think diversity increases stability has to do with this thing called the portfolio effect, right? And this is, basically taken from stocks. The stock market, we know that you should have a diversified portfolio, and this is an example, of all sorts of different types of stocks and bonds that a mutual fund might have. And the reason why you don't want all your money basically in one company is because when something bad happens to a specific company, it hurts less. You might, yes, lose some of your money that's in this purple slice, but that's okay. Perfect example is, let's say if you had all of your money in airline stocks. So in 2020, COVID comes along, right? And I think this is Delta Airlines, if I remember correctly. But it was hovering somewhere around the stock price was at $60 per share, and it went down to, I think, around like $12 or something down in this lowest portion in here. Well, it's a little less than 20. Doesn't matter really. But what if you had all of your money in airline stocks, that would be bad, right? Because you've lost almost 2/3 of your money, right? Now we expect the airlines to come back, but when if you had had your all your money and all your stocks diversified, you would have been able to not have just all of your money go away due to being only in one really specialized type of stock. And the same kind of thing has to do with species, right? While certain species might fluctuate up and down, the whole community itself might not be fluctuating that much. So what we see is that, the community stability is really predicted to increase with more diversity. So let's again think about a niche space. Now, if you have one species or really low species diversity, any fluctuation in this one species is going to hugely impact the abundance of how many species you have in this, or how stable the community is. So what we see is that when you increase and have more species, you have this overlapping niche space. So if this, dark blue species were to go extinct, or be extirpated, should we say, that's okay, because all the other species that they're overlapping with would be able to take up some of that slack and increase in numbers. So yes, this dark blue species might go away, but an increase in these other in the numbers of these other colored species might come up a little bit and equal out that level of those numbers. So what we see is actually individual stability, or with an increase in diversity, individual stability actually goes down. And that's because there's more basic species interactions. So think about, this red species. It needs to compete with the tan, the light blue, the blue, this darker tan, I'm not sure what color that is, purple, the yellow, and the green species. So the stronger and the more species interactions the species has, the harder it is, and the harder it is to basically survive, because you're competing with more stuff, and your numbers might fluctuate more. It's also a more crowded niche space here. There's nowhere you can be in here without any competition with something else. So the more diversity you have, oftentimes the less individual stability you have, but the more community stability that community will have. It's kind of it's weird, but it's the way it works. So let's switch gears a little bit and think about invasibility. And what we're talking about is the propensity for a community to get invaded by an exotic species. And what we see is increasing diversity will oftentimes decrease invasibility. The more diverse a community is, the harder it is for exotic species to come in. And that probably has to do with empty niche space. So if we think about this niche space here, let's say this is a community with only 5 species here. There's a lot of places that could, when I say places, what I mean is there's a lot of niche space. There's a lot of resources that are going unused here in this community here. Compare that to like a high diversity place where you have a lot of different species with different niches. Basically, there's in this niche space, there's no resources that are going unused. There's if an exotic species does come in, and let's say its niche is somewhere right about here. Well, that means it's going to have to compete with the gray, the blue, the tan, and the purple species, right? And the probability of it competing successfully against all of these established residences residents is pretty low. So what we see is the more diverse a community is, generally the harder it is for species to invade it. With plants, usually one of the ways this happens is that the more diverse you have, the more roots that you'll have going down into the ground, more root biomass, and that really drives down soil nutrients. So for a new species coming in, and if that soil is pretty poor, it's hard for those new propagules to grow into new plants or to have successful invaders come in. And we see, like a analogy here for animals is that this has been studied quite easily with filter feeding sessile animals, so animals that don't move anywhere and just kind of filter the water and get everything out of the water. What we see is the more species richness you have, the less physically unoccupied space. So this is a picture of rocky intertidal zone, and basically what we have are, the black things up here are mussels. So basically right there are mussels, and there's these gooseneck barnacles kind of right in this zone, but then there's these other encrusting barnacles that you can find in between the mussels up here, and then there's a whole bunch of starfish down here. So realistically, because we have all these different species groups here, it's really hard for a new species to come in here because there's simply just no spot for it. There's like no physical space for it to go. So theoretically, what we see is, or what we should expect to see, is that there's, with increasing diversity, we see less exotic species coming in and being able to invade. But what we see is in experiments is that really higher diversity sorry, I said that incorrectly. When we do experiments, what we see is that higher diversity decreases invasibility and all the mechanisms we just kind of talked about. But when we just observe things, what we see is that more diverse communities have more invasive species. So and that's kind of weird to think about, where, how many native or how many exotic species do we have here in Wisconsin versus how many exotic species do you have in the Amazon rainforest? And the answer is the Amazon rainforest actually has way, way more exotic species. And we see this, this relationship here, that as we increase native diversity, exotic diversity goes up. But there's actually a pretty simple answer for that. So the answer is that, basically, if an environment can support high diversity of natives, it can probably support a high diversity of invasives, right? So for all those reasons that we talked about, that latitudinal species gradient, there's just more species at lower latitudes around the equator, so we're going to see more exotics following that path too. Or following that pattern, I should say. There's another answer, is that there's this question is kind of looked at two different ways, where this observation right here, that the more diverse communities have more invasives, is really done at the global scale. Okay, but all those experiments are looking at local scales. So all those, where we take different plants and plant them at different diversity levels, that is all done, all kind of in the same spot, and it's done locally. So it's not really asking, the questions we're asking, and this invasion paradox is kind of at a different level as far as spatial scale, and which means it doesn't really apply. But basically what what the whole last part of the book in this chapter has a whole lot of like no, a whole section, a lot of information about what we don't know and how biodiversity is affecting ecosystem function and all sorts of different functions. This is, again, a really new science. We're not totally sure how ecosystem function is changing with biodiversity, but I at least highlighted some of the ways that we can think about how biodiversity is affecting ecosystem function. With that, I'll end it there and see you later.